The following is the Flat Earth 2018 Denver presentation workshop that I presented along with Dave Marsh. This is my half of the presentation. I told people there that I would present this on my channel, and if you would like a PowerPoint presentation copy of this, you can write me at the address provided at the end of this video, and I will provide the PowerPoint presentation to you. I'd also like to mention that I plan on doing a moon documentary, which will hopefully allow people to come to the realization that NASA is lying to us about the model without having to mention flat Earth. That should be something that I will have done in the future. So this presentation is based on the observer being able to prove the lies that NASA tells us about the moon. Now, most of this material has been covered on my channel in the past, so this isn't going to be new to a lot of you, but you may have missed some of this, so here we go. The Great American Eclipse of August 21, 2018 moved west to east across the United States, actually a little bit northwest southeast, as you can see here, and it had a complete path of totality of about 70 miles, give or take a few miles, depending on what your location was. I also plan to cover the different speed changes that occurred during this eclipse, which for the most part has been ignored. Now, NASA made a big to-do about the eclipse going from west to east, and they showed different models, and there's been all kind of people who are defending the globe showing how because the speed of the moon has to cover so much more in a path around the Earth that it moves actually faster than the Earth's rotation speed of 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. And thus all eclipses must proceed west to east. So you can go to NASA's website and you can pull up eclipses way into prior BC. And I chose to pick 1961 to 1980. And we're going to look at this particular eclipse over northern Russia on September 22nd. So here is the same eclipse blown up. This is September 22nd, 1968. And this evidence suggests that the moon path cannot be explained by NASA's model. The eclipse starts in the upper right-hand corner here, and the path of the eclipse heads from east to west. It then turns southwest, then due south, and then it turns to the east. Now, you can add to this that as the eclipse is actually, the path is moving this way, what is happening to the speed of the moon versus when it's down here moving west to east? And also, well, you have to look at it when it's moving north to south. Now, someone, or actually two people, took me to a simulation of eclipses and tried to show me that this was possible as the sun rays were coming over the top of the Earth. However, when they saw that the eclipse date was on the equinox date, September 22nd, 1968, they realized that that was a bum steer. So they had no explanation for this, and I would say neither does NASA. How can they explain eclipses moving west to east, as in the Great American Eclipse, and they show all the orbital data that proves it, and all these different people have come up with trying to show that it must move west to east when you have something like this that takes place. Now, many of you have seen my videos on the eclipse width being only 70 miles wide. What is the significance of that? Well, according to official science, when you have a single light source, which is what we have during an eclipse, you cannot cause the shadow of the blocking object, you cannot cause that shadow to be smaller than the blocking object. As you can see here, the lines fan out and the diameter of the diameter of the shadow is larger than the blocking object. Now, people will get in and say, well, you can have a smaller light source and that can cause, or a larger light source, and that can cause differences. Well, NASA tells us in their own model that the sun is 400 times further away than the moon, but the moon is 400 times closer, and the diameter changes then are equal. This is why there appears to be a perfect fit of the moon over the sun. So their own explanation destroys that. And as you can see here, this crisscross of the light rays is not possible from the sun being 93 million miles away. You have almost perfectly parallel rays coming to the moon, which would block it. So it is a fact, and you can use the same sun that the moon does. You can go outside and take any object, all right, use a round object because that's what the moon is supposed to be, use a ball, and you will find that the shadow is never smaller than the diameter of the ball itself. Can't do it. I have actually done this personally. I have gone outside with a ball and done this experiment. They're saying that the diameter of the moon is 2,159 miles. If the shadow of the blocking object cannot be smaller than the object itself, then we should have a minimum size of 2,159 miles across of the moon blocking. The shadow cannot be smaller than the object blocking light. Now people will say, yeah, but there's the partial eclipse shadow. No, there is no shadow in the partial eclipse. Absolutely none. This is a fallacy. Again, go outside and prove it yourself. Gravitational pull and tides. Science says that when the moon is on a certain side of the earth, that the moon's gravitational pull causes the water to pull away from the earth's surface and thus create a bulge. They say that the gravity is stronger than the rotational force of the earth. And then on the other side, they say the rotational force is stronger than gravity. So both sides have a high tide. When you really look at this, it really falls apart when you understand that the rotational force is virtually zero at the poles. So we should constantly have larger and larger tides as we go higher in latitude. But remember this diagram. So I have measured different things, high tides and low tides all over the earth. Here's the east coast of the United States, where the moon is located over Africa when there is a high tide. This in particular is Baltimore, Maryland. If you look at my original video on this, which is in August, I believe, or September of 2015, I give all the data with the tides and everything like that. And I give the dateandtime.org or dateandtime.com website calculations with this is where these photos were actually taken from. But I actually give the tide data. And you will see, using different measurements and observation, here's high tide at Hawaii. Notice how close the moon is here during high tide. But during Baltimore or East Coast of the United States, and there are variations along the East Coast, but generally speaking, high tide will occur when the moon is on the other side of the earth, or almost on the other side of the earth on the East Coast of the United States. And yet in the Pacific, you have high tide very close when the moon is there. Conversely, we can look at the second high tide for Baltimore, and the moon is equally far away on the other side. Here is low tide for Baltimore. The box, the distance of the box, the reason why I use the box is so we could use perpendicular lines, is to show the distance from the measured tidal influence. So Baltimore, Maryland is here. The center of the moon is actually here. You can see that this is the opposite, virtually the opposite of what science tells us. Now you can pick different parts of the world and do your own calculations. I had one person said in Ireland or Scotland, I can't remember which one it was, the tides are virtually all over the place. So what you're saying is not true. Well, what you're telling me is that the moon must not have any influence at all if the tides are all over the place. So what we should have here, when the moon is closest to the east coast of the United States, the east coast of the United States should be experiencing high tide. Do the work yourself. You will find out this is not the case. Although there is a relation to the moon and tides, you will find that this relation is not a gravitational relation. There are other forces that are obviously in effect other than gravity. Here's the other low tide at Baltimore, when the moon is virtually perfectly on the other side of the world. Now, science tells us that the moon is reflected sunlight. What science tells us is that the sun provides light to the moon, and then it's reflected back to the earth. Well, let's do some tests that you can do to show this is absolutely false. Now we're going to use simple observation, and this is what science tells us we should be doing. We should be using observation to prove science. Now we notice that the sun is from the red spectrum and the moon is from the blue spectrum. Silver is blue light, is from the blue spectrum, and yellow or red is what we see the sun usually, and that is from the red spectrum. Now when you look this up, or when I looked this up 3 years ago, you could see that there were definite differences. They have fixed this. They're saying that no, the moonlight is no different than the sunlight. And yet any artist, anyone that's really into photography or into colors and things like that, they can definitely tell you these are from two different spectrums of light. And since both lights are coming through the atmosphere, where they say the reason why we see yellow from the sun is because the blue is scattered out in the atmosphere, the same exact effect should apply to the moon, and yet it does not. We definitely know, don't we, through thermometers, that the sunlight is warming. You put something in the sun, and you will notice that the temperature goes up versus in the shade. Whereas you will find with many, many people who have done experiments in different ways, using different types of thermometers. I have done 3 different experiments myself, and eliminating any type of atmospheric difference that you might get with a blocking force. You will find that all the data shows that moonlight is cold, and we're going to look at a couple of those examples. I won't get into too many details with this, but I will have in the future an experiment that I plan on doing to show that the sunlight is antiseptic. This is why animals lay out in the sunlight, because it kills the bacteria so that they don't stink and get putrid, whereas the moon itself is considered to be a septic light where bacteria would actually tend to grow in moonlight. Again, a future experiment will show this. It is also reported that sunlight dampens fire and moonlight increases fire. And I have done an experiment with that. In fact, my friend Dave in the UK has done this experiment. We've done this with candles, and I will show that. I will not get into this presentation. This is a future object that I will look at, and that is that the sunlight is possibly fluorescent in nature and the moonlight is non-fluorescent in nature. Now here's one of the experiments that prove cold moonlight. This is from a video by Ashley Webster channel, and I'll have the link below. Moonlight versus moonshade temperature test. And what Ashley did was she took a infrared thermometer and actually touched it to the surface and showed that there was a 76.4 degree Fahrenheit temperature in full moonlight exposure, and when she touched it on the moon shade or shaded side, it was 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. And this is a typical result, about 2 degrees difference, although I've seen as high as 6 to 7 degrees difference from other people doing experiments. Now, a lot of people want to say if you use an infrared thermometer like one of these ones where you point and shoot, there's a diameter that you're getting that is too big, and so it's pulling in all kind of extraneous data. Well, this is actually a contact. She actually made contact to get the temperature on the surface. Let me add here that what I have found through my experimentation is that color makes no difference with moonlight, but material does. In other words, if you use a white piece of plastic that's exposed to moonlight and moon shade, and you take the temperature and then you take it from the exact same piece of plastic, but this time it's black, it isn't going to make any difference. But if you use leather instead of plastic, you may get a greater or less result. So the materials used seem to be a big important factor with moonlight for anyone wanting to do these type of experiments. All right, here's the candle moonlight test. This video is on my channel. I will leave a link below as well, or put in a card here so you could see it. What occurred here was candles were put into a windowsill, and there was a blocking mechanism, and the moonlight side, all the candles were lit, and at the same time all the candles were lit on the moon shade side. Now, one interesting thing to note here was there was a wooden beam in the middle of the window pane which blocked the moonlight from one of the central candles on the moonlit side. This becomes very important. So when we look down here, the side in the shade from moonlight burned pretty much 100% down. All right. So the shaded side burned all the way down. Now, the shaded candle here, right here rather, burned all the way down, just like on the shaded side over here. But where the moon was blocked, this candle right here, all right, this acted just like the shaded side. It burned all the way down. Whereas the other candles on that side, like these two, still had a significant amount of wax left. So we got the exact same side, both on the totally moon shaded side, as well as on the moonlit side, where one of the candles was shaded. It burned all the way down. Now we're saying that moonlight, the assumption was that moonlight is colder. But here it seems like it is the opposite result, where the colder side burned down faster. So the results were opposite of what we expected. This was almost like a double-blind study. So where do we go from there? Well, as it turns out, the science agreed with us. And you can pause this and read this, where it shows that a cooler light would cause the wax to burn differently, or actually would cause the wax to agree with what we showed right here, where the shaded candle was actually acted like it was in a warmer environment. But in reality, it was a colder environment for the ones that were in moonlight. It appears to be opposite. But when you read, this is the address here, sprotphysics.wise.edu. You can read this link here and go there. Let me just read the conclusion. So I would submit that the lower temperatures, in this case lower temperatures, why? Because of moonlight, causes an increase in wax viscosity at the base of the wick, slowing the amount of wax which travels up the wick and causing the candle in a low temperature environment to burn more slowly. So in a low temperature environment, which is what we see right here, the candle light burns more slowly. So the results actually panned out. Now, this is something that you can show anybody who's interested in looking at any of the science. Go outside before sunrise or after sunset, say half an hour to an hour afterwards, depending on what time of year. Wait for a time when you cannot see your shadow whatsoever because it's too dark, but yet you still have blue in the sky. And you'll notice that it'll still be blue, although not very blue, on the opposite side where the sun is, but it'll still be blue from horizon to horizon. But yet you cannot see your shadow. But then go out in the moonlight, when the moon is full and overhead, and I'm showing shadows from trees here being cast, and you will notice that there's absolutely no blue around the moon. So if the moon is reflecting sunlight, and it's actually brighter when the moon is overhead than at these times of the day, why don't we even see a small ring of blue around the moon if it's the exact same light? Because if it's reflecting sunlight, and there's nothing special about the properties of the moon, you can look this up as well. With the colors we see, which are pretty much off-white on the moon, we should have no difference in the scattering of blue, which is what they say is what sunlight causes here. So again, go out when you cannot see shadow, because people say, well, it's brighter then. But you'll see blue in the sky. And yet it's brighter when you can see shadows, your own shadow, and yet there's absolutely no blue in the sky, not even right next to the moon. This is an absolute proof in my mind that these are different lights. So in conclusion, evidence says that the moon doesn't fit NASA's model. If the moon blocks the sun at eclipse time, then the moon can't be any more than 70 miles wide. Now, I do not believe the moon blocks the sun during the eclipse, but if it did, instead of the 2,159 miles across moon, it cannot be, by the science of light and shadow, it cannot be more than 70 miles wide. And you can go outside with two different size balls and prove this yourself. I dare you to get a shadow to cast on from a smaller ball onto a lighter ball, Get the shadow to be smaller than the diameter of the blocking object. You cannot do it, and you're using the exact same sun that the moon does during solar eclipse. NASA's explanation for a west to east eclipse path doesn't hold water with actual historical data. There are many other eclipses that do similar such paths that make no sense in NASA's model. Tide data is all over the board and suggests a location relationship, but not a gravitational relationship with the moon. Empirical data, such as thermometers and candle burn experiments and many other experiments that have been done outside of what I have discussed here, proves that moonlight is a cold light and therefore can't be reflected sunlight. There is nothing in physics that can explain a reflection of sunlight being cold. Science admits that sunlight is antibacterial, where moonlight is the opposite, septic. You can still find those if you do diligent searches. Fire increases in moonlight and is dampened in sunlight. Many firefighters will attest to this. Again, diligent searches, you can still find this information, although it is becoming increasingly difficult. However, we are doing our own experiments and proving this. No blue in the sky in moonlight shows different property from sunlight. There should be some blue around the moon because there are periods of time when there's more brightness from moonlight than from sunlight, and yet we see blue in the sky during those periods where you can't even see shadow after sunset or before sunrise, and yet with brighter light from the moon we see absolutely no blue in the sky. So the conclusion is that what science says about the moon is simply a lie. Here is the address that you can use to get a copy of this presentation if you'd rather have the PDF rather than show this video. Thank you very much for your time.